Greetings, friends. A very warm welcome to this special commentary. This commentary I felt was necessary because we are in one of those years that have been called an odd year. An odd year because it is a year when the Passover falls on a weekly Sabbath. That in itself is not odd, necessarily. It is just one of the four patterns that God chose to use for his Passover to fall. This year it is on a weekly Sabbath. The reason it has become known as an odd year, or the odd year, is because of a question that arises then as to how to count to Pentecost in a year when Passover falls on the Sabbath. It's easy to illustrate the question, why it arises, if we look at this diagram I have for you. We have the Passover fall at Friday evening as the Sabbath begins. We have Passover fall here. And then the next evening begins the first day of Unleavened Bread, which is a Sunday, and happens to be a high day. We get down to the end of the week, we find that the seventh day of Unleavened Bread is a Sabbath again, which is something I didn't understand early on, that whatever day the Passover falls is also the same day that the last day of Unleavened Bread falls. That can kind of help us understand a little bit about these calendars. But the question then arises, since this is the only Sabbath to fall during the 7 days of Unleavened Bread, if we are to count from the day after this only Sabbath, that brings us to a Sunday that falls outside of Unleavened Bread. So there is the question that certainly has been a confusing one all the way back to at least 1974 in the churches of God. So the question again is whether we can count from a high day, which is the day after the Passover, which is on a Sabbath, and whether we can count this as a Sabbath that should be counted from, even though it's not inside the 7 days of Unleavened Bread, or whether we should count from the Sabbath during Unleavened Bread, the last holy day, and use that Sunday that follows outside of Unleavened Bread to reach our count to Pentecost. Our God chose to use one of four patterns for his Passover season. What I'm going to illustrate first is the 5 patterns that were available to our God during what we call our work week. I want to point out very important things that happen here in the weeks, the patterns that he chose. He chose Monday as a possible day of Passover, and he chose Wednesday, and he chose Friday. Of the 3 work days, he did not choose Tuesday nor Thursday, which we'll look at in a moment. Very clearly, in these 3 patterns, there are no issues whatsoever with where the Sabbath and the Sunday that follows fall, because in every case, the Sabbath and the Sunday fall together within the 7 days of Unleavened Bread. There is no question of these 3 patterns having any issue related to the count to Pentecost. I want to point out a couple of very interesting things about these patterns. And one reason that God shows at least two of these right here. Jesus Christ prophetically was to be cut off in the midst of the week. The only pattern that would fulfill that possibility is when the Passover happens to fall on Wednesday, as it did in the year that Jesus Christ gave his life for you and me. He was indeed cut off in the midst of the week. He died on a Wednesday. That is really remarkable and hearkens to the wisdom of God, and that nothing happens in God's patterns with himself and with Jesus Christ. Nothing happened ever with Jesus Christ that was by chance or happenstance. This was all planned perfectly by our great God and by Christ. So there is a very solid reason why God chose this pattern, why he chose Wednesday to be one of the patterns that he set up his spring holy days with. I'll point out here that in the case of a Friday Passover, one thing that definitely happens is that the only time of the four patterns that God shows that the high day is also a Sabbath is this one, when Friday is the Passover. We're going to see another detail in a little while about when the last day of unleavened bread is also a high day. Interesting, where God puts his stamp of approval and heightens and enhances the Sabbath day itself by making it a high day. In this case, this high day is the first day of unleavened bread. So here's at least two of the 3 work days that God chose that we can see why he chose those days. I don't see a reason why he would have or would not have chosen a Monday Passover. But Monday is another one that he chose. Now we take a look at 2 of the days of our work week that God did not choose. I'm sure you can see, as I can, that there doesn't seem to be any problem with God having these as a choice that he could have made. He could have chosen at least one of them in place of the 3 that he did choose during the week. At least one of them would be equal to one of the ones he chose, which doesn't seem to have any problem or any significance. But in both cases, these 2 patterns God did not choose. These 2 patterns allow both the Sabbath and the count day, Sunday, to fall within the 7 days of unleavened bread. Now, here is now the weekend days we're going to talk about, what we call the weekend days. And we're going to look first here at Sunday, because if God's grand design would have allowed Passover to fall on a Sunday, that would truly make that year the genuine, honest, and real odd year. Very clearly, we can see why it would do so. We would have a Sabbath, a weekly Sabbath, followed then at the end of the Sabbath, as Sunday began, we would keep the Passover. A full 24 hours would pass between this Sabbath and the 7 days of unleavened bread. So there's no connection between the Sabbath, this Sabbath, and unleavened bread. So the only Sabbath we would have to use as a marker, the only Sabbath connected, even remotely, to the 7 days of unleavened bread is, or would be, the 6th day of unleavened bread, right here. The problem with this is this would make the seventh day of unleavened bread, Sunday, it would make it a holy day. Please realize God did not choose this pattern. This in itself would suggest that God was avoiding any question about counting to Pentecost from a high day. God purposely left this pattern out because this would demand that in at least one of the four patterns we would have the opportunity to count from a high day, from a holy day, whereas the other three patterns would be counting from a work day. I find this fascinating. I hope you do too. I hope you see something here that we can understand that can help us find more of the truth about how and why God did not choose certain days for his pattern and why he chose others. So now we come to the final day that God chose, the fourth day that God chose to be the Passover. That day is the weekly Sabbath, the fourth day that he chose. And here we see what I call the perfect Passover season. We have a Saturday Sabbath Passover. We have Sunday, the first holy day, a holy day. And then we have the last day of unleavened bread, which is a weekly Sabbath, which also then becomes a high day. And this is where I want you to recall what we just looked at a moment ago. When Friday is Passover, then the last day of unleavened bread is, the first day of unleavened bread in that case, when Friday is the Passover, the first day of unleavened bread would be not just a holy day, but also a Sabbath. In this case now, God puts his stamp of his Sabbath on the last day of unleavened bread. And in this particular pattern, he adds one more layer of importance to his Sabbath, because the Sabbath is the day of the Passover. There is a reason why God separates normally the Passover event from the 7 days of unleavened bread. And that is because the symbolism of Jesus Christ in the unleavened bread that we eat on Passover evening is Jesus Christ himself, who is totally unleavened, never sinned. That's the symbolism. But the symbolism for us during the 7 days of unleavened bread is for us to put sin out of our lives, because we are full of sin. Very different setup. And why I've said for years that there would be no need for any holy days of any kind to depict the plan of God unless Jesus Christ had come and given his life for us. So I see this, what I call a perfect Passover season, where God puts his stamp on both the Passover as a Sabbath day and the last day of unleavened bread as a Sabbath day. And of course, the Passover, if we think about it, certainly would be compatible with the Passover and the Sabbath, because the Sabbath came before Adam sinned. And the Sabbath depicts the creation of Jesus Christ, the creation of everything that he did, he made for us and for all humanity and for all of his creatures. All of his vast creation is symbolized in the Sabbath. And then we have the end result of the Sabbath, the promised rest to mankind and to the entire creation. The promised rest is what the Passover allows by reconciling mankind to God. So to me, this is a perfect picture, perfect Passover. I have one more thing here to get to. Because I don't want to minimize the seriousness of the question about how to count to Pentecost. I understand that many of the brethren, after worldwide blew up, our church that we believed was one and always to never fall apart, did fall apart. And brethren, for some time, were left out in the cold, floating around, many of us floating around. But then after some time, brethren began to settle in different groups. There are upwards of 40 different groups at this time that people could make a choice of where they wanted to land. And so in most cases, brethren have answered the question about how to count to Pentecost just based on where they landed. Whatever that group happens to believe is what they have chosen to accept for now. I want to point out that perhaps we as a people have unwittingly become complacent about other issues that we can find because we suffer from the problem, perhaps in this case, of not seeing the proverbial forest for the trees. As we have spent so much time and energy focusing on just one tree, that of the question of how to count. And please, I'm not trying to minimize that question. I know it is extremely serious, and we must answer it as honestly as we can, as we believe God would want us. If we take the normal year of the count to Pentecost, in a normal year, we have one Sabbath during unleavened bread, followed by the 7 Sabbaths of the count to Pentecost. That means there are 8 Sabbaths between Passover and Pentecost. Here, in this special year, when Passover falls on a weekly Sabbath, then we wind up having 9 Sabbaths. So in a typical year between Passover and Pentecost, there are 8 Sabbaths. Very interesting, because 8 Sabbaths is remarkable in that Pentecost is also the 8th day of the last 7-day cycle in our count. So 8 is important. God is trying to remind us every year that 8 is also involved as a number that is important in this count to Pentecost. But when we get to this particular year of the Sabbath Passover year, we find that we actually have 9 Sabbaths. 9 Sabbaths to get to Pentecost. Pentecost. Why 9? Well, 9 is a prime number, the highest prime number, before we get to double digits. It denotes spiritual completion, for one thing. And is that not what we're trying to reach? We're trying to get to that point in this example of the calendar going from Passover to receiving God's Spirit. Isn't that the point? Reaching for God's Spirit. that will help us complete the journey that we are on. The number 9 also is the number of months of gestation for a human. So in my mind, another thing where God is trying to get our attention about the number 9 here, and especially in this unique year when Passover falls on a weekly Sabbath. So what is the most important thing about the number 9? We all have this on the tip of our tongue. 9 is the number of fruits of God's Holy Spirit. Those fruits that come with the free gift of God's Spirit. If we use it wisely, those gifts or those fruits are love, joy, peace, long-suffering, gentleness, goodness, faith, meekness, which is humility, and temperance, which is self-control. I would suggest it would be a good idea if we could perhaps put in our minds possibly spirits with the 9 Sabbaths that will unfold between Passover this year and Pentecost, the 9 Sabbaths. Certainly, I think we could all agree that Passover being on a weekly Sabbath is certainly the first fruit of God's Holy Spirit in action, where that is showing the love of God, where He gave His only begotten Son, and where the Son willingly laid down His life. Those are the scriptures we equate each year with the Passover. 1 John 3:16 and John 3:16. And joy, which is a big aspect of the 7 days of unleavened bread. A Sabbath that falls during unleavened bread certainly is joy. Joy when Israel walked out of Egypt. Joy for us as we are leaving the sins and the confusion of this world to the reality and the peace and the love and alongside the gentleness of our God. So perhaps that's something we can do this year as we also contemplate how to resolve, if we're still questioning, how to resolve the question of this so-called odd year. This is not an odd year at all. It is never an odd year in my mind. It is, as I pointed out, to me this is the perfect Passover year. Not an odd year at all. We have 2 Sabbaths that fall between Passover and the last day of unleavened bread. And we have 9 Sabbaths then that fall right up till Pentecost. So it is my hope that I have shared with you some information that can help resolve the question of God's mind about the count to Pentecost. And also to add some interesting details that can help us reflect more deeply on the fruits of God's Holy Spirit, which is the point of the whole season, getting to where we have receipt of God's Holy Spirit.